So going through the slides themselves, the first slide here, distribution analysis, what I wanted to talk about, we're going to do more examples in general ledger, as I will tell you, but in the accounts payable section, we'll first talk about the distribution analysis. And what this is an accounts payable general ledger posting ledger, in essence. So if I had a purchase, that purchase, let's say 50% of it is consulting and 50% of it is the travel and entertainment for that consultant. Each of those would be part of the distribution of that entry. What I have here in the distribution analysis is a bit of data here that you can then summarize by account number and description and by vendor number. So then you can start to look, as we're showing in the slide here, basically how many vendors do I just have one vendor for it? How many vendors do I have so many vendors for it? Kind of thing. And then we can scroll in and double click and scroll into the details. The other thing we're going to talk about is calculating an average days payable outstanding. And it's a way of just kind of showing you how to build an average, which is useful, but also to make it more applicable to the accounts payable area, and showing how we can basically utilize some of those average fields in the analysis that we're doing. And last but not least, just figured I'd then take a look at the identifying the longest time to enter a vendor invoice. So what we're going to look at is the number of days to enter, and we're going to be looking at the maximum level of those number of days to enter as well. And along the way I may play around a little bit in this payables data, because I work with payables data quite a bit, and try to show you a few extra things along the way. And again, switching a few gears here, what I want to do is go into that distribution data first, because I think that might be more useful for us to talk through. Okay, over to the right here are a couple of things that we will talk about later, so I'm going to hold off on talking about that stuff. I built that in there for now. Right now I'm just going to highlight A through E for purposes of our presentation here. Bear with me one second, folks. Okay, so and with that highlighted, I'm going to select the Insert Pivot Table button. And inserting that pivot table, it's from A to E, 8,000 or so, sounds about right. Hit the OK button, and now we have our tool. I can then bring in the account number, the account description down below there, and then the vendor number as well. So we're kind of doing a three-peat kind of analysis. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the total line and get rid of that subtotal. So then we basically just have, let me just kind of scroll out a little bit here. Now we have kind of just the account number, description, and vendor number. I'm not even going to worry so much about the values from this point of view, and I wanted to show you this. What you can do is bring the distribution amount in, which is the total amount, but what I can then do is change that to a count. So let's talk about it from a count point of view. Hit OK. And now we have a count here. Again, I don't like these total lines. Again, it might just be me, but I like to get rid of those total lines as much as I can. So I've pulled those out, and now I've created a template that shows how many postings do I have for a particular vendor number in a particular account. And there are some that we have a lot for, and again, we can probably just bear with me one second here, just kind of total these up. And what I can do is kind of quickly look through this list, and there are many ways to do this, but if I just kind of scroll out, dramatically scroll out to a point where you can barely see anything right on the screen. I can't read it either, everyone, so don't worry about it. What I can identify or try to identify are any situations where you might have one vendor for a particular account, and it really doesn't look like it. It looks like maybe right here we have something where we have a few vendors in a particular account. But what's also interesting is to look for vendors that have lots of activity in an account. So here's an account, whereas if I scroll in, dues and publications, we have so many people that are getting that. Again, from usually, why are we doing this? Why do I care to look at a particular vendor pool and looking at how many vendors we have? Well, for some of the accounts that we have here, again, it may be useful, it may not be useful. Mobile phones might be useful to see, why do we have so many vendors for mobile phones? Why don't we kind of consolidate down to maybe one mobile phone carrier? Another option, maybe office supplies. If I had that data in here, you'd probably see. Oh, here we go. Even though this is basic data, if we kind of scroll out on office supplies, I guarantee you that'll be it's a decent long list. But a lot of times that can be a massive long list that you can look at. Another thing that you might want to look at is really just the outside consultants. I mean, there's so much concern these days with the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and how consulting costs are, usually a lot of places where they place a lot of the agency fees that are, that can become these FCPA compliance issues. And again, I mean, even just at this particular data set, all of this data here is consulting costs. So that's something where you can very quickly, at a very, very high level, see and say, wow, we have probably about 100 or so of these consultants here. Okay, now, not that we have a lot of data in here to work with, but let's just imagine you then kind of honed in on consulting. So one of the things that you could do to kind of tailor how you're working with your pivot table is you can bring in the account description to the report filter. So that might be one option that you may want to utilize. Oops, sorry about that. And by bringing in the account description into that, I can now highlight that, and I can either select multiple items, which I won't for right now, but I can go down to my outside consultants, which are here somewhere, outside consulting, boom. And that's a way to very quickly kind of highlight just a particular vendor pool based on the account number. Then, in taking a look at the data, if I want to drill down further, and this is where data mining comes into play, where you can drill into your data, if I select the total, what it'll do is it'll bring me the actual data records that relate to that. So that is a way, utilizing pivot tables, to drill down into the data very quickly and be able to see, going from the high level down to that lower level. So let me just kind of delete that. No need for that right now. And and we'll move onwards to another type of pivot table. So one way to kind of get back to square one with your pivot table is just drag all of your columns out, right, and kind of start over. And what I wanted to do is take a look at calculating an average days payable outstanding. But I won't be doing this on the distribution file. I'm going to be moving over to my payables file for that. And a days payable outstanding is essentially where you have your check date and your invoice date. And what I can do is I can insert a column right in between there, and I can call it DPO, days payable outstanding, and I can make it my check date minus my invoice date. Now it comes in with that crazy looking date format. We'll fix that in a second. We're going to highlight that data and say that that's a number. And we'll take away a couple of the decimal places there as well, because we don't need that. And now that we have this days payable outstanding in here, I mean, some of them are quite long, right? I mean, 337 and 171 days. I mean, I don't know if you're paying your vendors this slowly, but that is something that could happen. What we're now going to do is insert a pivot table. I will just, for our sake, I'll just highlight all of the data, make it simple. And I'm going to bring the vendor number into the row label section down below here. So we have all of our vendors here. And I'm going to then bring in my days payable outstanding, which I think I just jumped over there. I must have. Bear with me one second here, folks. I'm going to hit my refresh button. Computer is definitely having a little fun with me today. So now it added that field in there, so thankfully that happened. I think it went back to a previous stratification or previous pivot table data set, and that's why it got a little confused there. So I had to hit my refresh button, which is up here, to kind of tell Excel, don't use that old pivot table format that I had. You need to use the new data, which now has that inserted column. And I'm going to insert that into the value section. And automatically it sums up the values, which doesn't make sense. So for this vendor number, if I double click and look at the data there, it's going to sum up the DPO, right, and say the DPO is 887 days. But what it's not saying is that that's for 7 invoices. Okay, so that is not what we want to do. What I'm going to instead do is I'm going to change that with the value field settings to an average. And that will very quickly now create an average, and I can make it look a little prettier by going to value field settings once again and hitting number format. And in that number format I can click number, and maybe just something like that would be nice. So that looks a lot nicer and a lot tighter at this point. So now I have my average days payable outstanding for each vendor. And that's something that could be useful. We could do it for the entire company, which is also useful. I think it might be in my total line, yep, down below here. So that 122.36 is the average days payable outstanding. Again, 4 months. I did that for illustration purposes, but it takes them 4 months to pay anything. And again, that's just the average for the entire organization, which again is quite useful. Now, if you wanted to use this data in some way, I mean, what I usually do is I will highlight the entire pivot table. One way to do this, and it's hard to show you how to do this, but you can go basically Control Shift and the number 8 key. So Control Shift and the number 8 key, and that'll highlight all of the data in the pivot table. So that's one option. You can then copy that data, and I normally create a new sheet by right-clicking and saying Insert Worksheet. And then when you paste it, you want to paste values only. And the reason you paste values only is because otherwise you will get a pivot table being created here, and that's not what you want. Now that I have these values created, it's a little bit easier to work with. I mean, this is actual raw data now that we're working with. There's nothing that is pivot tabled in here in any way. And again, something that we can utilize. So with this average, though, what you could do, and I just for purposes of today I won't do it, but what you could do is relate this back by vendor based on a VLOOKUP. So you could VLOOKUP that vendor number back to this payables data here, to this vendor number here, and you could relate what is the average DPO related to the actual DPO for that one payment. And you want to look for situations where you're again off of that particular average for that particular vendor. So again, just kind of doing maybe a value filter here and taking a look. We can search for 27 like that. Now the average for that particular vendor is 122.04, but they did have a couple of items in there that were very, very heavy with that 472 listing. So they're kind of all over the board in how they're paying people, but that's a way to relate that data back and utilize that as part of your analysis. One of the other things I wanted to show you, and just kind of bringing the data back to where we just have the vendors in this column, what I can now do is bring the amount into this column here. And so now we have the sum of values. Now this is interesting. I mean, we could look at the bottom value here and say, from a high level point of view, we have about $4 million in here, so $4 million. Now, while that total is there, I like to show you some other value field settings that I think are even more interesting, and that's showing values as. You can then say percentage of grand total. I mean, that's one option right there, and you can hit OK. And then that way what it's doing is it's calculating a percentage, which again at the bottom is 100%, but at the top, as you go through this, you have each item being a part of that. What you can then do as part of your pivot tabling is you can sort this from largest to smallest. It's saying sort on vendor number by sum of invoice amount in descending order. So then that brings us to a point where it brings the top vendors based on a percentage to the top. Now, if you also want to look at the dollar values, that's fine. I'm going to clean them up by going to my value field setting, number format. Gets a little repetitive doing this stuff, but bear with me one second. Okay, so now you can see, yeah, we had about $4 million, 393. It's about 10%, and downward through the data file. But what I like about this is, and bear with me one second as I highlight here, you can see, maybe I'll just stop right around here. You can see down below here I have this sum feature. And if you ever want to change what's down here, you get a count, you have some, you can right click and you can basically change whatever you'd like to put in here, be it maximum, minimums. There's a whole lot that you could add here. But about 70% of the file is made up of 15 items. So 15 vendors make up 70% of the data. Now let's kind of go through the rest of it, right? So now I can quickly say 273 vendors make up 30% of the data. So, going to the whole stratification discussion or question from before, this might be even a better way to look at things, is to maybe look at things from a percentage point of view and to say, well, where do I get my 80% mark in my data, and then just kind of calculate my stratas based on my 80%. In this particular case, 70% of the file was about $50,000. So you can basically say anything over $50,000 from a total vendor point of view, I want to look at because they make up 70% of the data. Anything under $50,000, again, maybe you want to break that up into a few more strata, and again, you can just kind of highlight these percentages here to almost see, well, the next 20%. Let me just quickly do that. Next 20% is about 25 more vendors, and that's starting at about $20,000. So you could have 20 to 50, over 50, and then under 20. And that would really give you a nice breakdown into 3 categories of your largest, mid, and small vendors to go take a look at.